Nobody in Harlan County ever called me smart. They called me stubborn. They called me a fool. One man called me a coward right to my face, in front of 8 neighbors, because I walked away from a brand new John Deere. I let him say it, because my father taught me that the loudest man in the room is usually the one who owes the most money. There is a ledger book sitting on my kitchen table. Black cover, cracked spine. 40 years of oil stains pressed into the edges like a record of every hard season we ever pulled through. My father started writing in it in 1919. I finished it in 1989. In between those 2 dates, that book saved my land, exposed a bank's fraud before a county judge, and taught one very arrogant man that paper and ink outlast everything, including pride. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Every story has a beginning. And this one begins not with the ending I just described, but with an April morning in 1972 when a man in a starched green polo shirt tried to sell me a future I did not want. Colt Briggs was 52 years old that spring, and he had farmed the same 950 acres in Harlan County, Iowa, his entire adult life, not borrowed, not leased from some holding company with an office in Chicago. Farmed. The land had been in his family since his grandfather broke the first furrow with a team of mules in 1911, and every acre of it was paid for in full. No liens, no operating notes, no variable rate agreements tucked into manila envelopes he had not read carefully enough. He was not a tall man, but he was built the way men who work iron and soil get built. Compact and deliberate, with hands that looked like they had been assembled from spare parts. All knuckle and scar tissue, and the permanent black half-moons under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. His face carried the specific weathering of 30 years squinting into the Iowa wind, deep lines cut horizontally across his forehead, a jaw that did not move much when he was thinking, and moved even less when he had already decided something. He drove a 1968 Ford F250 with a cracked vinyl bench seat and a heater that worked on its own schedule. He wore the same type of work boots he had worn since 1955, a medium brown lace-up with a steel toe, resoled twice. His hat was a faded green case cap that June had tried to throw away in 1969, and he had retrieved from the trash without comment. June Briggs was 49 that year, a quiet woman in the specific way that certain women who have thought deeply about everything are quiet. She kept the household accounts in a spiral notebook, tracked every dollar of seed cost and fuel expense and equipment repair with a precision that would have impressed any accountant. Had any accountant ever thought to ask? She had grown up the daughter of a grain elevator operator in Carroll County, and she understood money the way farm women of her generation understood it, not as something to accumulate but as something to respect, because she had seen what happened to families who did not. Their son Raymond was 24 that year, recently married, farming a rented quarter section 2 townships over. He had his mother's patience and his father's stubbornness, which in combination made him the kind of man who was difficult to advise and impossible to discourage. He would have a son of his own in 1977, a boy named Owen, but that was still 5 years away. The tractor at the center of everything was a 1967 John Deere 402, and Colt had bought it new from the dealership in 1969 with cash money saved over 11 years. No trade-in. No financing. He wrote a check and drove it home on a Thursday afternoon in October and felt a satisfaction he was not able to put into words then and could not fully put into words even years later. It was the satisfaction of ownership without obligation, the satisfaction of a thing that was entirely his. By the spring of 1972, that 402 had just over 4,000 hours on it. The paint had faded to the particular soft green of old John Deere iron that has spent real time in real weather. There were dings in the fenders and a rust stain along the fuel cap and a crack in the left side of the seat cushion that he had repaired with a strip of electrical tape in 1971. It had no cab, no radio, no air conditioning. In high summer, it offered 2 fenders and an open sky and the full, unfiltered experience of an Iowa afternoon. He would not have traded it for anything. Wade Donovan had opened his John Deere dealership on the east side of Harlan in 1966, the year he turned 27. He had grown up in Harlan, the son of a hardware store owner, and he had the kind of easy social fluency that certain men acquire when they spend their childhood behind a retail counter watching their father charm customers. He was good-looking in the uncomplicated way of men who have never been seriously tested by anything, with clean hands and a wide smile, and a way of leaning forward when he talked that made whoever he was addressing feel like the most important person in the conversation. He drove a Cadillac to work and kept his green John Deere polo shirts pressed and starched. He had a waiting list for the new 443. Already 6 months long, and he talked about it the way some men talk about a racehorse they have just acquired. The cab on, he would say, shaking his head like a man describing a miracle. Sealed glass, air conditioning, AM radio. A man could spend all day in that cab and come in fresh as the morning. Colt had come to the dealership that Tuesday not to buy anything. He had come to pick up a set of replacement O-rings for the 4020 hydraulic line that his parts supplier had ordered through Donovan's service department. He was in and out in 8 minutes on a normal visit, but Wade caught him at the door. The showroom was bright with fluorescent light and smelled of fresh paint and rubber and the particular synthetic optimism of new machinery. 3 other farmers were there that morning, men Colt had known for years. Dale Pritchard from out near Kirkman, Howard Sims and his younger brother Len, who farmed together on their father's old place north of town. They were standing around the new 4430, and Wade was talking. And the room had the atmosphere of a revival meeting where the congregation already believed. Wade saw him and moved with the practiced ease of a man who has made a living converting skeptics. He put a hand on Colt's shoulder and steered him toward the machine before there was a chance to redirect toward the door. "Look at her," Wade said. 125 horses at the PTO, turbocharged, 16 forward speeds with the quad range, soundguard cab, air conditioning, AM radio. You are farming 950 acres with an open station machine that is 5 years old. You are leaving efficiency on the table every single day. Colt looked at the tractor. It was genuinely impressive. The way a show horse is impressive, all gleaming paint and precise engineering and the complete absence of any history. It had the quality of something that had never been touched by actual work, which was accurate, because it had not. He placed one hand briefly on the hood. The metal was cool and smooth and told him nothing. "What is the interest rate on the financing?" Colt said. Wade waved his hand. "Don't let numbers stop you from making a smart decision. The numbers work. Everybody is doing this. Grady Keller next door to you just put a deposit on a 4630, bigger than this one, and he is picking up another 200 acres north of the county line. You do not want to fall behind." Colt removed his hand from the hood. Grady Keller was 38, 11 years younger, and farmed the neighboring property to the east. He was a capable farmer and an ambitious one, the kind of man who read the commodity forecasts the way other men read the sports section, with a focused hunger that was not entirely about the information itself but about what acting on it might prove. He had bought his first tractor on credit in 1965 and had not paid cash for anything significant since. Colt looked at Wade and said one more thing. He said it quietly, without any particular heat. He said, "My father farmed through the 30s. He taught me 2 things, trust the land, fear the bank, in that order." Wade's smile did not move, but something behind it shifted. He said, "This is not the 30s. We put men on the moon. You cannot farm with a depression mentality in 1972. Colt picked up his O-rings from the parts counter and walked to the door. That was when Wade said it. He said it loud enough for Dale Pritchard and Howard Sims and Howard's brother Len to hear clearly, and he said it with a tone that was not quite contempt but was not far from it. He said, "You are a fool. Colt Briggs, a stubborn, backward fool who is going to watch better men pass him by." Colt did not turn around. He got into the F-250, started the engine, and drove the 15 miles back to his farm on the county road, the windows down, the spring air carrying the smell of turned earth and last year's corn stubble. He thought about his father. He thought about a specific afternoon in the fall of 1932 when he was 12 years old and had ridden with his father to a farm sale 4 miles east of their property. A neighbor named Cal Rourke had lost his place. Everything was being sold. The furniture from the house, the harness, the equipment, 2 draft horses that stood in the lot with their heads low and their eyes dull. He remembered standing next to his father in the crowd and watching Cal Rourke at the edge of his own auction with his hat in his hands, looking at the ground. His father had put a hand on his shoulder that day and said nothing. The hand said enough. The 402 was waiting in the machine yard when he pulled in, sitting between the disc and the planter, its green paint warm in the afternoon sun. He walked around it once, checking nothing in particular, just making contact with something solid and owned and paid for. Then he went in for dinner. June had made pot roast and did not ask about the trip to the dealership. She had a way of knowing when a conversation had already happened inside a person and did not need to be repeated out loud. She poured his coffee, sat across the table, and they talked about the weather coming in from the northwest and whether the north field was dry enough to disc. The next 3 weeks passed in the specific density of Iowa spring, when the calendar compresses and every day carries the weight of 10 because the window for fieldwork is narrow and the soil does not negotiate. He ran the 4,020 long days, pulling the disc through the corn ground, turning the dark earth that smelled of iron and rot and the deep biological activity of a field getting ready to grow something. He ran the machine the way he always ran it, with attention, listening to the engine note change as the soil deepened, easing the throttle when he felt resistance rather than forcing through it. On the morning of May 14th, in the North 80, on his third pass of the day, he felt it. It was a shudder, small and precise, running up through the seat and the floorboards and into his hands on the wheel. He pulled the throttle back and listened. The engine sounded clean. He moved the synchro range lever from 6th to 5th and let out the clutch, and the sound that came from somewhere deep in the transmission was the sound of metal failing in a specific and catastrophic way, hardened teeth shearing, a gear surrendering to forces it could no longer resist. He pushed the clutch to the floor and killed the engine. The silence that settled over the North 80 was total except for a meadowlark on the fence post at the field's edge, singing something that had nothing to do with broken transmissions or the economics of spring planting. He sat in the seat for a long moment. 47 acres still unturned. The sky to the west was clear but would not stay that way. He thought about the window, about what it was going to take to get this machine back to the shop and what it was going to cost in time to fix it right. Then he climbed down and started walking. He got the Farmall M out of the far shed. The M was a 1948 machine with a narrow front end and a 4-cylinder gas engine that had been rebuilt once and was reliable in the way that old simple things are reliable. Not because they are sophisticated, but because there is very little about them that can go wrong. It was not a powerful machine. It was enough machine. It took him the better part of the afternoon to drag the disabled 4020 and the disc back to the farmstead. The little tractor strained and spun its narrow front tires in the soft spots, but it got the job done without complaint. That evening, as the light went long across the yard, a truck pulled in. New Ford, clean, still with the dealer sticker residue on the rear window. Grady dropped the electric window and leaned one arm out and looked at the 4020 sitting dead in the machine yard with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for this moment without admitting it. "Heard you had some trouble," Grady said. Colt wiped his hands on a red shop rag and nodded. Grady shook his head slowly in the way of a man performing sympathy. He said Wade Donovan could have a loaner unit out by tomorrow morning. "Keep you on schedule. Rental rate is steep this time of year." But he left the end of that sentence open in a way that was not accidental. "I will manage," Colt said. "Manage how?" Grady said. "You cannot disc 900 acres with that M. By the time you get the 4020 fixed, if you can even get the parts, you will have missed your window. The ground will have crusted and you will be planting late, and you know what late planting in this county means for yield." Every word of this was true, so I said, "I will manage," he repeated. Grady shrugged and raised the window and backed out of the lane, his truck quiet and smooth on the gravel. And then he was gone, and the yard was quiet again, except for the frogs starting up in the low spot by the east fence. Colt went into the shop. Splitting a John Deere 4020 is not a job that announces itself as anything other than exactly what it is, which is the complete disassembly of a machine that weighs 8,000 pounds at the point where its two primary halves are joined. It requires stands and hoists and the willingness to drain every fluid from the machine's body and lie on cold concrete and work with long bars on bolts that have been torqued down for years and have no interest in moving. He built the splitting stands himself from heavy channel iron, welding them in the shop while the M's engine ticked as it cooled. He drained the hydraulic fluid, nearly 15 gallons of it, thick and honey-colored, into a series of 5-gallon buckets. He disconnected the fuel lines and the throttle linkage and the wiring harness and every hydraulic connection he could reach, each one coated in a decade of accumulated grime that turned the shop rags black inside of a minute. The bolts that held the two halves of the tractor together were 1.5 inches in diameter and torqued to several hundred foot-pounds. He used a 4-foot cheater bar on his largest socket wrench, putting his full weight and both arms into each one until each bolt gave way with a crack that sounded like a small firearm in the quiet of the shop. He worked until past midnight the first night. He worked through the next 3 days with the methodical focus of a man who has decided that a problem is simply a series of steps, and that steps can be taken one at a time, regardless of how tired he is or how much of the planting window is disappearing. When the tractor finally opened, the two halves rolling apart on the stands, he found the source of the failure. A sheared pinion gear on the B-range countershaft, a piece of hardened steel about the size of a man's thumb that had simply reached the end of its service life. He ordered the replacement from a specialty parts house in Nebraska, a 3-day wait, and used the time to clean and inspect everything he could reach while the machine was open. June brought coffee to the shop door each morning and set it on the workbench without interrupting him. On the third evening, she stood in the doorway and looked at the tractor in its split condition, the two halves separated in the light of the single overhead bulb, and said, "How much longer?" He looked up from the service manual. 2 days after the parts come, he said. She nodded and went back inside. That was the whole conversation. The parts arrived on a Thursday, and he had the tractor back together by Saturday evening. He torqued the bell housing bolts in sequence, refilled the hydraulic system, bled the air from the fuel lines, and turned the key. The engine fired and settled into its idle with a sound that was, to his ear, slightly cleaner than before. He let it run for 20 minutes, checking the dipstick and the hydraulic pressure and the temperature gauge, then backed it out into the yard and sat in the open seat and listened to it run in the dark. He had lost 11 days. In the accounting of Iowa spring planting, 11 days is a significant number. It is not catastrophic if the weather holds and the soil cooperates and a man is willing to run long days to recover the lost time. He ran long days. He ran the 4020 from first light until he could no longer see the disc frame clearly enough to maintain his rows, which in late May was well past 8 in the evening. June kept dinner warm and did not comment on the hours. By the end of the month, he had his ground prepared and his corn in the soil. The yield that year was lower than his neighbor's by about 12 bushels to the acre. His input costs, however, were a fraction of theirs. The 1972 Russian grain deal sent commodity prices into territory that had not been seen in a generation. Corn moved from $1.50 to $3 and climbing. Soybeans followed. The Radio Farm Report talked about it every morning with an excitement that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the way people had talked about land prices in 1928. He took his profit from that harvest and drove into Harlan. He did not stop at the dealership. He drove past it, past the row of gleaming new tractors in the lot and the banner Wade had hung across the showroom window that said, "The future is now," and he parked in front of the First National Bank. He walked to the teller window and asked to make a payment on his mortgage. The teller, a young woman who had not been born when the mortgage was originated, had to call the branch manager because no one at the counter was entirely sure what the procedure was for a payoff of this nature. The manager, a man named Gerald Cord, came out with the paperwork and looked at Colt with an expression that was not quite confusion but was related to it. Cord said, "Mr. Briggs, you understand that this loan carries a very favorable interest rate. Most people in your situation would continue carrying the note and deploy these funds toward additional acreage or equipment," Colt said. "I understand that." He slid the cashier's check across the counter. There was a pause. Cord processed the payment. A different woman came out from the back with the deed, which had the word "paid" stamped across it in red ink. She handed it to him with the slightly uncertain air of someone who was not entirely sure this was a thing people actually did anymore. He folded the deed twice and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and drove home. The rest of his profit from that year went into United States savings bonds and certificates of deposit at a credit union in Council Bluffs. Safe instruments, boring instruments, the kind of thing that made financial advisors change the subject. Grady Keller, that same autumn, bought the 200 acres to the north and put down a deposit on a second large tractor. He was farming close to 800 acres now, leveraged against land values that the University Extension Office was projecting would double again in 5 years. At the co-op in October, he talked about his plans with the ease of a man who has never had a plan fail, about the new combine he was looking at for the following year and the additional ground he had his eye on to the south. Colt was at the co-op the same afternoon, picking up a bag of seed treatment. He listened from 2 aisles over without contributing to the conversation. That evening he sat on the porch after supper while the last light left the sky. June came out and sat next to him without being asked, and they watched the darkness settle over the fields together. The good years kept coming. 1973, 1974, 1975, corn stayed high, soybeans stayed high. The university men and the government men and the banker men all said the same thing in slightly different language, which was that this was the new normal, that global demand was structural and permanent, that the American farmer was feeding the world and the world was willing to pay for it. Grady bought more ground. Wade expanded the dealership, built a new service bay, hired 4 mechanics, started taking winter vacations in Florida. He drove a newer Cadillac. The 2 men seemed to confirm something about each other, the way certain kinds of ambition recognize itself across a fence line and is encouraged by what it sees. Colt maintained his equipment with a precision that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with the understanding that a machine failing in the field at the wrong moment is not an inconvenience, but a threat. He kept the 402 greased and adjusted and oil changed on a schedule he had worked out from the service manual and his own experience with the machine. He knew its sounds. He knew the particular note of the engine under load in heavy clay versus the lighter sound it made in sandy ground. He knew the feel of the hydraulic lever when the oil was warm versus when it was cold. He was not prospering in the way his neighbors measured prosperity. He was not buying ground. He was not expanding his equipment line. His name did not come up at the co-op in the way that Grady's name came up, which was with a certain admiration mixed with envy. His name came up in a different way. Poor old Colt, still running that 4020, could have been something by now if he wasn't so set in his ways. He heard it. He let it pass. What he was doing, quietly and without announcement, was building a position that had no vulnerabilities. He had no operating notes. He had no equipment loans. His land was paid for. His inputs were paid for at the start of each season from cash reserves, not credit. His cost of production per bushel was so far below his neighbors that even in a bad year he would be fine. And in the years after a bad year, when everyone else was restructuring debt and selling equipment, he would still be fine. He did not talk about this at the co-op. In the fall of 1979, he was in the shop sharpening sickle blades when the farm report on the radio mentioned a man named Paul Volcker, who had just been appointed to lead the Federal Reserve and who was proposing to break the back of inflation by raising interest rates to levels not seen in living memory. He put down his file and walked over and turned up the volume. The announcer explained what the prime rate was, what a significant increase in it would mean for variable rate loans, what it would mean for anyone who had borrowed heavily against land values that had climbed steeply during the decade. The announcer's tone was careful and measured, the tone of a man who understands the implications of what he is saying and is trying to be responsible about how he says it. He stood in the shop and listened to the whole segment. Then he turned off the radio and stood in the quiet for a long moment, looking out the open shop door at the machine yard where the 4020 sat, its paint soft and worn in the fading light. He thought about Grady and his 2 large tractors and his 1,200 acres of leveraged ground. He thought about Wade and his new service bay and his Cadillac and his banner that said, "The future is now." He thought about the farm sale in 1932 and Cal Rourke standing at the edge of his own auction with his hat in his hands. He turned off the shop light and went inside. June had made soup and cornbread. He sat down and she set a cup beside his plate and he looked at the steam rising from it and said, "It is going to get hard." She said, "I know," he said, "not for us." She looked at him across the table with the expression of a woman who has been paying close attention to the same man for 30 years and understands exactly what he means. She said, "I know that too." They ate their soup outside. The October wind moved across the harvested fields and the sky was full of stars and the land lay quiet under them, patient as it always is, belonging to no one and everyone and specifically to whoever is willing to stay with it long enough. He slept well that night. He always slept well. He was right about the timing. He was wrong about how fast it would arrive. The spring of 1980 came in wet and then stopped being wet entirely. And by July, the sky over Harlan County had turned into something hard and indifferent that no longer had any interest in producing rain. The corn that had shot up fast in the wet June curled its leaves inward during the afternoons. a cellular response to moisture stress that every farmer in the county recognized and none of them could do anything about. The soil between the rows cracked in patterns that looked like something drawn by a hand that was angry. He watched it during cultivation passes and said nothing about it to anyone. He had seen dry summers before. He had seen the land refuse to cooperate and then relent and then cooperate again because the land was not punishing anyone. It was simply being what it was, indifferent to human plans and responsive only to water and time. What he had not seen before was a dry summer layered on top of the specific financial architecture that his neighbors had built during the previous 8 years. That combination was something different. That was not a weather event. That was a reckoning. Grady was farming 1,200 acres by the summer of 1980, leveraged against equipment notes and land purchase loans that assumed corn at $3 a bushel and beans at $8. The drought pushed yields down by 30% in some fields. The Russian grain embargo, announced from Washington in January as a political response to events in Afghanistan, had slammed the export market shut and sent prices into a decline that the farm broadcasters on WMT tried to describe in neutral language but could not entirely conceal the alarm underneath. Grady ran his equipment long days trying to compensate with management what he could not compensate with rainfall. He had 2 large 4-wheel drive tractors, both bought on credit, both requiring monthly payments that did not adjust for drought years. He had a new combine on a floor plan that the dealership had arranged through a finance company in Omaha. He had operating notes at First National for his seed and chemical inputs. The total of what he owed in that single year, when written on paper, was a number that would have been difficult to breathe around. The combine failure happened on a Wednesday in late September, during the soybean harvest, when the beans were ready and the weather window was tight and every hour of machine time mattered in a way that could be measured in bushels and dollars. Grady's John Deere 8820 was 4 years old and had cost more than most houses in Harlan County when it was new. It stopped in the middle of his best field with an alarm sounding from the console and a red light flashing that no one on his crew had seen before. The combine's engine ran. The threshing mechanism did not. The header would not respond. The hydraulic control module, a sealed black box of circuit boards and solenoids mounted behind the operator's console, had failed in a way that produced no external symptom, no smell of burning, no visible damage, nothing that a man with a wrench and 40 years of mechanical experience could find and address. It was a failure that existed entirely within a system that did not allow for human intervention. Grady called the dealership. Wade sent his best mechanic, a young man trained on the new electronic diagnostic systems, who arrived with a multimeter and a laptop computer and spent half a day determining what Grady had already suspected, which was that the module was dead and could not be repaired in the field, and could not be sourced locally. The nearest replacement was at the John Deere depot in Moline, Illinois. Minimum 3 days for delivery. The service truck pulled out of the field lane at 4 in the afternoon. Grady stood in his soybean field next to a machine worth more than most men earned in a decade, watching it leave. To the west, a line of thunderstorms was building in the way that late September storms build in Iowa, fast and tall and without much interest in the crops they were about to reach. He stood there for a long time. Colt saw the weather coming on the same Wednesday afternoon from his north field, where he was finishing his last cultivation pass before harvest prep. He brought the 4020 in, greased the fittings, checked the oil, and spent the evening going through his combine, a 1971 machine that was older than anything in Grady's equipment lineup and had never once had a circuit board in it. He adjusted the concave clearance, sharpened the cylinder rasp bars, replaced a worn section on the feeder house chain. By 9 that evening, it was ready. He started harvesting his beans on Thursday morning. The thunderstorms that came through Wednesday night dropped 2 inches of rain in 40 minutes and then moved east. They did not produce hail on Colt's ground. They produced hail on Grady's south field, the quarter section where the beans were heaviest, for 11 minutes. 11 minutes of hail on standing mature soybeans with no combine available to harvest them. When the module arrived from Moline on Saturday and the combine was running again, 30% of Grady's best beans were on the ground. Colt finished his harvest on a Sunday and sat on the porch that evening with coffee, listening to the distant sound of Grady's combine running in the dark, trying to recover what the weather had left, and he did not feel satisfaction. He felt something closer to sorrow, the specific sorrow of a man who saw something coming and could not stop it and did not particularly want to say, "He told you so," because being right about a bad thing is not the same as the bad thing not happening. The interest rates arrived the following spring with the force of something geological. Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve raised the prime rate to 18% in the first quarter of 1981 and kept going. By summer, it touched 21%, a number Colt heard on the radio one morning while eating breakfast and sat with for a long time without speaking. June watched him across the table and did not ask what he was thinking because she already knew. A farmer who had borrowed at 8% and was now being asked to service that debt at 21% was facing an arithmetic problem that had no solution that did not involve losing something. For farmers who had borrowed at 8% to buy ground at $2,000 an acre that was now worth $900 an acre, the problem was not arithmetic, it was catastrophic. The foreclosure notices began appearing in the Harlan County Courier in the spring of 1981. They were printed in small, dense type in a section of the paper that had previously been used for auction announcements and estate sales. At first there were 2 or 3 a week. By fall there were 8 and 10. Names that Colt recognized. Farms that had been in the same families since before either of their owners was born. He read them the way a man reads a list of casualties, carefully, without looking away. Wade's dealership began showing the strain in ways that were visible from the road. The new equipment lot, which had been full and rotating through the previous years, developed gaps. Tractors sat with hours on them, traded in by men who could no longer make the payments, priced at numbers that reflected what the finance companies were willing to accept rather than what the machines were worth. Wade spent more time on the phone and less time on the floor. His polo shirts were still starched, but something had left his face, some quality of unexamined confidence that had been there so long it had seemed like a permanent feature. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1981. Colt was at the kitchen table finishing his second cup of coffee and looking at the seed catalog when June brought the mail in from the box at the road. She set the stack on the table and went back to the counter without comment, which was how she handled mail that she had already seen and formed an opinion about. He sorted through it. Electric bill, seed company circular, a letter from Raymond about a drainage tile issue on his rented ground. At the bottom, an envelope from First National Bank of Harlan with a return address that listed a name he did not recognize. Harrison Locke, branch vice president. He opened it. He read it twice. Then he set it flat on the table and looked out the window at the machine yard where the 4020 sat in the early light and thought about what he had just read. The letter stated, in the specific language that lawyers use when they want to sound precise and inevitable at the same time, that according to the records of First National Bank of Harlan County, there existed an outstanding mortgage obligation against the Briggs property, originating in 1938 and not satisfied in full according to bank records. The outstanding principal, per their documentation, was $1,840. With accumulated interest calculated from the date of alleged default, the total obligation stood at $14,200. The bank was prepared to pursue legal remedies if the obligation was not discharged within 30 days. He had understood it correctly. His father had paid that debt in full on the 14th of September, 1938. He knew this not from memory because he had been 18 that year and not involved in his father's financial arrangements, but from something else entirely, from something that June knew and he was about to find out she had known for a very long time. He set the letter down and said her name. She came to the table and read it standing. Her face did not change in any dramatic way. She read it the way she read most things, with a focused stillness that meant she was processing rather than reacting. When she finished, she folded it along its original crease and set it back on the table. She went to the kitchen cabinet beside the stove, the lower left door, the one that stuck in humid weather and that Colt had been meaning to replane for 2 years. She opened it and reached to the back and brought out a tin box he had seen before without ever asking about. It was a rectangular tin, the kind that had originally held hard candy, painted green with a faded gold design on the lid. It had a small dent in one corner. She set it on the table in front of him. He looked at her. She said, "Your father kept his important papers in his toolbox. When we moved into this house in 1955, I went through the toolbox to sort the tools from the other things. I found this inside. I read what was in it. I knew what it was." He opened the tin. Inside, there were 4 items. A folded land survey from 1911, A photograph of his parents standing in front of the original farmhouse, the one that had burned in 1947. A small envelope with 2 stamps in it, the old kind, the ones that cost 3 cents, and a ledger book, black cover, cracked spine. The oil stains on its edges were older than he had realized, had been accumulating since before he was born. He opened the ledger. His father's handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of a man who had grown up when paper cost something, and waste was not an abstraction, but a thing with consequences. Page after page of entries, dates, equipment hours, fuel costs, repair parts, seed prices, yield records, the record of a farm life maintained with a watchmaker's consistency across 30 years. He found the page dated September 14th, 1938. The entry read, in his father's hand, "Final payment on original land note, principal, $1,840, paid in full to G. Harmon, branch manager, First National Harlan, receipt number 4471, witnessed and signed by Judge C. Albright, Harlan County, this date." Beneath the entry, in a slightly different ink, the same handwriting, "Let no man tell you this land was given. It was earned twice, once by your grandfather and once by me." At the bottom of that same page, attached with a rusted paperclip, was a small rectangle of paper. A bank receipt, handwritten, the amount, $1,840. The date, September 14th, 1938, a signature in the payee line that matched the name his father had written, and in the lower right corner, in a different hand, the signature of a county judge in a notation that read, "Witnessed and acknowledged." He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. June set a fresh cup beside his hand and sat across from him, and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. He finally looked up and said, "How long have you known about this?" "Since 1955, she said. He said. "And you kept it?" She said. "I kept it because I knew there would come a day when it mattered. I did not know when. I knew it would come." He looked at the receipt. He looked at his father's handwriting. He thought about Harrison Locke's letter with its precise legal language and its 30-day deadline and its $14,200 of manufactured obligation. He picked up the phone and called a man named Dale Puckett, who had practiced law in Harlan County for 31 years and who was one of the few lawyers Colt trusted, because Puckett charged reasonable rates, kept his word, and had grown up on a farm outside Audubon and understood the specific way that rural people thought about land and obligation. Puckett came to the house 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, and sat at the kitchen table and read the bank letter and then read the ledger entry and examined the receipt with a small magnifying glass he carried in his shirt pocket. He set the magnifying glass down. He said, "Colt, this receipt is a legal satisfaction of debt. The judge's signature makes it a witnessed instrument. It does not matter what the bank's internal records show or do not show. This document exists. It is real. The obligation was discharged in 1938, Colt said. So we have a case." Puckett said, "You do not have a case. You have a defense. There is a difference. They brought this to you. You did not bring it to them. What we need to determine is why they brought it to you now, in 1981 when this debt was settled 43 years ago." That question answered itself within the week. Puckett made inquiries through channels that lawyers have access to and returned with information that was not surprising, but was clarifying. Harrison Locke had joined First National as vice president 18 months earlier, transferred from a larger institution in Des Moines. He had been brought in specifically to address the bank's exposure to agricultural loans that were underperforming in the current interest rate environment. His mandate, from what Puckett could determine, was to identify assets that could be used to offset losses elsewhere in the portfolio. The Briggs farm, debt-free, with clear title and well-maintained improvements, was worth substantially more than the surrounding properties that were encumbered with multiple layers of obligation. It was exactly the kind of property a bank with a troubled loan book would find attractive. The letter about the 1938 debt was not a clerical error. It was a strategy. Puckett filed a response with the county court in April of 1981 and the bank's legal team, a firm out of Des Moines that Locke had brought in with him when he transferred, countered with a filing that questioned the authenticity of the receipt and requested a full evidentiary hearing. The hearing was scheduled for September of 1982, 18 months away. In the meantime, the bank placed a precautionary notation on the Briggs property title, a legal instrument that did not constitute a lien but complicated any transaction involving the property and, more immediately, caused the First National Loan Officer to decline the annual application for a small operating line of credit that Colt had carried as a reserve for years. He had never actually needed that line. He had carried it the way a prudent man carries an umbrella. He didn't need it this year either, but the denial made clear what Locke was doing. He was applying pressure, attempting to create a cash flow problem where none existed, hoping that a 17-month legal fight would wear down an older farmer who might eventually decide that settling was easier than prevailing. Locke did not know who he was dealing with, but Colt went through this 1981 planting season on cash reserves and did not miss the operating line. He cut every cost he could cut without cutting into the farm's productivity. He deferred the new hydraulic hose said he had been planning to install on the disc. He put off the shop roof repair until fall. He bought fuel in larger quantities when the price dipped and stored it in his own tanks. June managed the household accounts with the same precision she had always brought to them, tracking every expenditure in her spiral notebook, finding the small efficiencies that accumulate into real savings over the course of a season. She had not been raised to complain about difficulty. She had been raised to address it. That year's harvest was adequate, not exceptional. The weather had been cooperative enough, and his yields were consistent with what the county extension office reported as average, which in a year when many of his neighbors were failing to break even on their input costs, was a position of considerable strength. The foreclosure sales continued through 1981 and into 1982 with a regularity that had moved past shock and into something duller and more exhausting. The courier printed the notices and people read them and talked about them at the co-op in the elevator. And then the sales happened and neighbors bought each other's equipment at prices that did not cover what was owed. And the banks took the land and tried to sell it into a market where no one was buying. Grady held on longer than most people expected. He sold one of the big four-wheel drives in the spring of 1982 and used the proceeds to reduce his operating note. And he restructured his land loans through a different lender in Omaha. And he cut his planted acres back to the ground he was most confident about. He was doing what a resourceful man does when the walls are closing, which is find every handhold available and use it without pride. But the math did not work. The math had not worked since the prime rate went past 15, and no amount of resourcefulness changes mathematics. The auction notice for the Keller farm appeared in the Courier in October of 1982. Colt read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and set the paper down and sat with it for a while. The hearing at Harlan County Court had been scheduled for September. He had spent the summer going over the ledger with Puckett, making sure every detail was documented, every element of the receipt's provenance established. Puckett had located a handwriting expert at the University of Iowa who had examined the ledger and the receipt and produced a written assessment confirming that both documents were consistent with the stated date of their creation, that the paper, the ink composition, and the handwriting itself showed no evidence of alteration or fabrication. The morning of the hearing, Colt dressed in the same dark suit he wore to funerals and church, which was the only dark suit he owned. June straightened his tie at the kitchen door without being asked and then stepped back and looked at him and said, "Your father would have been proud." He picked up the tin box and put it under his arm and walked to the truck. The Harlan County Courthouse was a brick building from 1903 with tall windows and wooden floors that had been walked smooth by a century of people bringing their disputes to be resolved. The courtroom smelled of lemon oil and old paper and the specific institutional gravity of a room where the county had been conducting its business since before anyone currently present had been born. Harrison Locke was already there when he arrived, seated at the plaintiff's table with two attorneys from the Des Moines firm. Locke was a large man in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with the particular grooming of a man who has decided that his appearance is part of his authority. His suit was dark gray. His watch was visible when he moved his arm. He did not look at Colt when Colt came in. The bank's lead attorney, a man named Reeves, opened by presenting the bank's documentary record, a loan ledger showing the original 1938 mortgage and an absence of any corresponding satisfaction entry. He presented this with the confidence of a man who has built a case on institutional authority, on the assumption that what the bank's records show is what happened, and that what is not in the bank's records did not happen. Puckett let him finish. Then Puckett asked Colt to approach the bench. He walked forward and placed the tin box on the table in front of the judge, a man named Warren Gill, who had been on the county bench for 16 years and who farmed a small property himself on weekends, and had the patience of a man who has heard many arguments and learned to wait for the one that matters. Puckett opened the ledger to the page dated September 14, 1938. He placed it before Judge Gill. He placed the receipt beside it. He placed the university handwriting expert's assessment beside that. Reeves objected to the receipt's authentication. Judge Gill read the handwriting assessment. He looked at the receipt. He looked at the ledger entry. He looked at the signature in the lower right corner of the receipt, the county judge's hand, the witnessed and acknowledged notation. He looked up at Reeves and said, "This appears to be a witnessed legal instrument." Reeves said, "Your Honor, the bank has no corresponding record of this transaction. Without corroborating institutional documentation, the authenticity of a private document cannot be assumed." Judge Gill said, "Counselor, a document witnessed and signed by a sitting county judge in 1938 does not require corroboration from the institution that received the payment. That is precisely the function of a judicial witness." There was a silence in the courtroom that had weight to it. Puckett requested that the court order the bank to produce all internal memoranda and documentation related to the Briggs property file for the period 1938 through 1945. Reeves objected. Judge Gill granted the request. It took the bank's legal team 4 days to produce the documents. On the third page of an internal file review memo dated 1962, a staff examiner had noted, in the bureaucratic shorthand of institutional record-keeping, that the Briggs account showed a potential documentation gap for the period 1936 through 1942, and that the physical receipt for the final payment could not be located in the on-site files. The memo continued. It noted that attempts to contact the account holder to resolve the discrepancy had been made and that the matter was being closed pending further review. Further review had never happened. What the memo established, in language that could not be read any other way, was that the bank had been aware since 1962 that its own records for the Briggs account were incomplete, had documented that awareness internally, and had taken no action to resolve the discrepancy or notify the account holder. Locke's letter demanding $14,200 had been written with knowledge of this internal gap. He had sent a demand letter about a debt he had reason to believe might already be satisfied, in a climate where a debt-free farm was the most valuable asset in a county full of distressed properties. Judge Gill looked at Reeves for a long moment, then he ruled. The court found the 1938 debt fully satisfied by the documented receipt and the judicial attestation contained therein. The bank's precautionary notation was ordered removed from the Briggs title within 10 business days. The court further ordered a formal inquiry into the bank's conduct in issuing a demand letter in 1981 with knowledge of the 1962 internal documentation gap, and referred the matter to the State Banking Commission for review. Locke left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. He did not look at Colt. His attorneys followed him into the hallway and the door swung shut behind them, and the sound it made was not dramatic. It was just a door closing. Colt sat at the defendant's table for a moment after everyone else had begun moving. He looked at the ledger, still open on the table, his father's handwriting, the careful small letters. "Let no man tell you this land was given. It was earned twice." He closed the ledger and put it back in the tin box and walked out of the courthouse into the October light, where the oaks along the street had gone their full autumn color and the air smelled of leaves and cold coming and everything that continues regardless of what happens inside any given building on any given morning. June was waiting in the truck. She had not come inside. She had sat in the passenger seat of the F250 with her hands folded in her lap for the 2 hours the hearing had taken, and when he got in and set the tin box on the seat between them and started the engine, she looked at his face and read what was there. She said, "Good." He pulled out of the courthouse parking lot and they drove home on the county road. The fields on either side harvested and bare, the soil dark and resting, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else needed to be said. Harrison Locke resigned from First National Bank of Harlan County 6 weeks after the State Banking Commission opened its review. He returned to Des Moines. The commission's investigation eventually resulted in a consent order requiring the bank to audit its agricultural loan files for the period 1930 through 1950 and notify any account holders or heirs where documentation gaps existed. It was a quiet resolution. It did not make the front page of the Courier. It was a paragraph in the business section, the kind of paragraph that most people skip. Colt read it on a Saturday morning and then turned to the farm report section to check the corn futures. The numbers were what they were. The land was still his. That was the only number that had ever mattered. The winter that followed was the quietest he could remember. Not quiet in the way of peace, but quiet in the way that comes after a long illness has finally broken, when the body is still too tired to do much more than breathe and the mind has not yet caught up to the fact that the danger has passed. The legal matter was settled. The land was secure. Life on the farm returned to its rhythms. The 4020 needed its winter service. The shop roof that had been deferred through the legal fight finally got its new tin. June put up the last of her canned tomatoes in November, and the basement shelves had that particular organized fullness that had always meant, to both of them, that the season was properly closed. But the county around them was not quiet. The county was still coming apart at the seams, one farm sale at a time, one foreclosure notice at a time. The Courier running those small, dense columns of legal type that had become the most widely read section of the paper in a way that no one would have predicted 3 years earlier. Men Colt had known his entire life were losing things their grandfathers had built. The losses were not dramatic in the way that fires or floods are dramatic. They were slow and procedural and final, and in some ways that made them harder to witness. Grady's auction was held on a Saturday in February of 1983, on a day when the temperature sat at 12 degrees and a thin wind came down from the northwest with nothing between it and the farmyard except 100 miles of open ground. The auctioneer's voice carried across the lot in the cold air with a clarity that seemed cruel. Each item called out and bid on and sold in the flat, efficient language of commerce that has no room for the history of a thing, only its current market value. Colt stood at the back of the crowd with his hands in his coat pockets. He had not come to bid. He had come because Grady had been his neighbor for 22 years, and when a man loses something that large, the decent thing is to be present for it, even if there is nothing useful to do. The two big four-wheel drive tractors went for less than half of what was owed on them. The combine brought slightly better, but not enough to matter in the larger arithmetic. The tillage equipment, the planter, the grain cart, the shop tools, all of it called out and dispersed into the hands of other men who needed what it represented more than they needed the money they were spending. Grady stood near the house the whole time. He wore a canvas coat that Colt recognized from 15 years of seeing it across the fence line. He stood with his arms folded and his face arranged in the particular expression of a man who has made a private decision not to feel anything in public, and he was mostly succeeding. His wife had gone inside early. His two oldest boys, teenagers now, stood near the machine shed door and did not look at anything directly. The auctioneer closed the sale at 2 p.m, and the crowd dispersed to their trucks, and the farmyard emptied with a speed that seemed almost indecent, the way crowds always leave when the thing they came to see is finished. Colt walked across the yard to where Grady was standing. Grady looked at him without surprise. There was no hostility in it. The hostility had been burned off somewhere in the previous 2 years, replaced by something that was too exhausted to be anything other than honest. Colt said, "I want to talk to you about the land," Grady said. "The bank owns the land." Colt said, "Not for long. I made them an offer this morning." Grady went very still. Colt said it plainly, without ornament or build-up. He had spoken to the bank's new acting manager, a local man named Phil Sutter, who had been brought in after Locke's departure and who had the look of a man trying to clean up someone else's mess with inadequate tools and not enough time. The bank needed the Keller property off its books. It was a performing farm in terms of its physical condition, but it was carrying debt that exceeded its current market value, and the bank's regulators were applying pressure to reduce agricultural exposure. Colt had offered cash, a number below what the land had been worth in 1978, but real money in a market where real money was the only kind that moved anything. Sutter had called him back within the hour. The deed would transfer within 30 days, Grady said. And then what? His voice was level. He was not asking in anger. He was asking because he needed to understand what was coming next, and he had learned in the past 2 years that assuming the best outcome was a habit he could no longer afford. Colt said, "And then I want you to farm it. The home quarter. The 80 with the house and the buildings. You farm it on shares. 60% to you, 40 to me, until you are back on your feet. You and your family stay in the house. Rent when you can, not before." The wind moved across the empty farmyard. Somewhere in the machine shed a loose panel, rattled once against its frame, and then was still. Grady looked at him for a long time. He was not a man who showed vulnerability easily, and he was working hard not to show it now. But there was a quality in his face that Colt recognized from 40 years earlier, from the face of Cal Rourke standing at the edge of his own auction. It was the look of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. Grady said. Why? Colt thought about it for a moment. He said, because the land needs a farmer who knows it. You have worked that ground for 15 years. It knows you. That is not nothing. Grady nodded once. A single precise movement, the kind that means more than a longer response would. Colt drove home and told June what had been agreed. She listened and then went back to what she had been doing, which was mending a tear in one of Owen's flannel shirts, her needle moving in the small, careful stitches she had made for 40 years. After a moment, she said, Your father would have done the same, Colt said. I know, she said. He did do the same. In 1947 for the Hennessy family over on Route 6. You were too young to remember. He had not known that. He sat with it for a while. The spring of 1983 arrived without ceremony, the way Iowa springs arrive. Mud first, and then a day that smells different from the day before, and then the inexorable pressure of the ground wanting to be worked. He ran the 4020 through his own ground in April, and in May, he watched Grady run a borrowed farmall through the home quarter, preparing his first rented rows. And there was something in that sight that was not triumph and not satisfaction, but was closer to the feeling of a thing being returned to its right order after a period of disorder. Wade Donovan came in December of 1983 on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was flat white and the temperature had been below freezing for 11 days straight. Colt heard the car in the lane before he saw it and came to the shop door and recognized the vehicle as a Chevrolet that was at least 10 years old, which was not a vehicle he associated with Wade. Wade got out slowly. He was in his mid-40s that year, and he looked it in a way that he had not looked at the last time Colt had seen him at the co-op, which had been 2 years ago. The dealership had been closed for most of a year by that point, the inventory repossessed by the floor plan lender, the sign taken down, the building standing empty on the east side of Harlan with the particular vacancy of a place that had been busy and then suddenly was not. He walked toward the shop with his hands in his coat pockets and stopped about 10 feet from the door. He said, Colt, I know I don't have any standing to ask you for anything, Colt said. Come inside. It's cold. They stood in the shop in the warmth of the kerosene heater, the 4020 behind them with its hood up, mid-service, a fresh oil filter on the workbench. Wade looked at the tractor the way a man looks at something he has a complicated history with. He said what he had come to say without working up to it, which Colt respected. He said the bank had taken the building and the new inventory when the floor plan lender called the note, but they had not wanted the old equipment, the service truck, a 1974 Ford with a utility body and a small crane mounted in the bed, and the shop tools, the good ones, the snap-on sets and the hydraulic press and the engine hoist. If he could sell those, the money was his to keep. He needed it to move his family to his wife's sister's place in Nebraska while he figured out what came next. He named a price for the truck and the tools. It was fair. In the current market, it was more than fair. Colt said, I will take it, but I am paying you what it is actually worth, not what you are asking. Wade started to say something and stopped. Colt named a figure that was $800 above what Wade had asked. He said he would have a cashier's check ready the following morning. Wade stood in the shop for a moment. He was a man who had built his identity around a particular kind of ease, a fluency with people and situations that had made him good at selling things and effective at navigating rooms where everyone was watching. That ease was gone, and what was underneath it was something simpler and less polished and, Colt thought, considerably more honest. Wade said, I was wrong about you. I said things in 1972 that I should not have said, and I have thought about it since. Colt picked up a wrench and turned back to the engine. He said, You believed what everyone believed. There is no particular shame in that, Wade said. You did not believe it. Colt set the wrench down and looked at him. He said, My father showed me what happens when the believing stops matching the arithmetic. I had an education you did not have. That is not a virtue. It is just a circumstance. Wade looked at the 4021 more time. He said, How many hours on her now? Colt said, Just past 9,000. Wade shook his head slightly. Not in dismissal, in something closer to recognition. He picked up his coat from the workbench and left. The cashier's check was ready the next morning, and they shook hands at the shop door in the cold air, and that was the last time Colt saw him for many years. The service truck turned out to be useful in ways he had not anticipated. The crane in the bed made pulling engines and lifting heavy components considerably easier, and the utility body gave him organized storage for shop supplies that had previously lived in a state of approximate arrangement on the workbench. He used it for farm work and occasionally loaned it to Grady when Grady needed to move something the pickup could not manage. The years from 1983 through 1989 did not announce themselves as recovery. Recovery rarely does. It comes the way seasons come, not as an event but as an accumulation of smaller things, a better yield than last year, a debt retired, a field that responds well to a change in management, a morning when the work ahead feels possible rather than merely necessary. Grady earned his 60% honestly. He was a good farmer, had always been a good farmer, and the difference between the man who had lost his farm and the man who worked the rented ground was not ability. It was scale. He had been trying to farm an operation twice as large as he could manage well, with financing 3 times what the operation could service in a bad year, on 80 acres, with no debt, farming the ground he knew better than any ground in the county. He was exactly what he had always had the potential to be. By 1985, he was making regular rent payments. By 1987, he had put enough aside to buy a used combine, an older machine that he maintained himself with the thoroughness of a man who can no longer afford to have things fail. He started paying down the informal debt between them ahead of any schedule they had never formally agreed on, showing up at the kitchen door on the first of the month with an envelope and a brief accounting of where things stood. The way his father had probably done before the debt markets made that kind of exchange seem old-fashioned. Colt accepted the payments without ceremony. June recorded them in her spiral notebook. In the spring of 1988, he drove to the county recorder's office and had the deed to the home quarter prepared for transfer. He brought it to Grady on a Tuesday afternoon in April, unannounced, at the door of the machine shed where Grady was doing pre-season work on his combine. Grady looked at the document without speaking for a long time. He said, "This is not the arrangement we made." Colt said. "The arrangement was until you got back on your feet. Look at your feet." Grady looked up from the deed. His face had the particular stillness of a man managing something that is larger than the available container. He said, "I don't know how to thank you for this," Colt said. "Farm it right. That is enough." He drove home on the county road with the windows down, the spring air coming in across the fields that were just beginning to show the first faint green of the season. And he thought about the specific quality of satisfaction that comes not from accumulating things, but from being the kind of man his father had been. The kind of man who understood that what you do with what you have is the only measure that matters when everything else has been said and accounted for. Owen Briggs was 12 years old in the summer of 1989, his grandfather's grandson, in the specific way that certain qualities skip a generation and arrive in concentrated form. He was a quiet boy, not withdrawn, but economical with his words the way people who are paying close attention tend to be. He had Colt's eyes, gray and level, and June's precision, a tendency to do things correctly the first time rather than approximately and then correct. He had been coming to the farm on summer weekends since he was 8, sleeping in the spare room and following his grandfather through the morning chores with the focused attention of someone taking an examination. He asked questions that were specific rather than general. Not how does a tractor work, but why does the idle change when the hydraulics are loaded? Not what is that tool, but what is the difference between using this wrench and that one for this particular bolt? Every question got a direct answer, without simplification, treated with the seriousness it deserved. On a Saturday in late July, with the corn in its full summer height and the air heavy with the particular smell of a field at peak growth, they were in the shop together doing a tune-up on the 4020. Owen was working on the injector nozzles, cleaning and gapping them with a precision gauge, his hands careful and unhurried. Colt was going through the hydraulic system, checking pressures, working his way through the list methodically. Owen set down a nozzle and looked at the tractor and then at his grandfather and said, "Dad says we could afford a new one now. He said the 4020 is 22 years old and there are machines that would do twice the work." Colt set down the pressure gauge. He looked at the tractor for a moment, not dramatically, just the way a man looks at something he has worked alongside for a long time and trusts completely. He said, Your dad is right that we could afford it." Owen waited. Colt put his hand on the fender, the metal warm from the July morning coming through the shop door. He said, "There are two kinds of things in this world, Owen. Things that work for you and things that own you. Sometimes those things look the same from the outside. You have to look at the paper underneath to know which is which," Owen said. "What do you mean by the paper?" Colt said, "I mean what is written down, what you owe and to whom, what someone can take from you if the year goes wrong. A machine you own outright works for you. A machine with a loan attached to it works for the bank until the loan is satisfied, and you work for both of them. The machine does not change. The terms change everything." Owen picked up the next nozzle and began cleaning it. He said, "So we keep the 4020 because it is paid for." Colt said, "We keep it because it is honest. It does what it does, no more and no less. When it breaks, I can fix it. I understand every system in it. I know where every failure will come from before it comes, because I have been listening to this machine for 20 years. That knowledge is worth something that does not show up on any balance sheet." He picked up the pressure gauge and went back to work. After a moment he said, "Your great-grandfather started a ledger in 1919. He wrote down every repair, every cost, every payment, in a book with a black cover that is sitting in a tin box in your grandmother's kitchen right now. That book saved this farm in 1982, not the law, not a lawyer. A book that a man kept because he believed that what he did with his days was worth recording accurately." Owen set down the nozzle gauge and looked at his grandfather. Colt said, "People will tell you that the old ways are slow, that new systems are better because they are faster and more powerful and they do more. Sometimes that is true, but fast and powerful are not the same as reliable, and reliable is not the same as yours. When you borrow to buy something, you are borrowing the future to pay for the present. I learned what that costs by watching it cost other men everything they had built." They worked in silence for a while after that, the sounds of the shop filling the space between them, the clink of metal on metal, the hiss of the pressure gauge, the birds in the cottonwoods outside the open door. Owen finished the last nozzle and set it with the others in the sequence they had come out in, ready to go back in the correct order. He looked at the row of clean components and said, "Can I ask you something?" Colt said. "Go ahead." Owen said, "Were you ever afraid that you were wrong, that everyone else was right and you were the one making the mistake?" Colt considered this without rushing toward an answer. He said, "Yes. In 1973, when Grady was farming twice my acres and making twice my income, and I was lying on the shop floor trying to get that transmission back together. I thought about it. I thought about it in 1978 when the commodity prices were still high and everyone around me had gone bigger and was showing for it. I thought, maybe I'm the one who has it wrong. Maybe my father's lessons belong to a different time." He set down the pressure gauge and looked at his grandson directly. He said, "But then I would think about what my father actually said. He did not say do not take risks. He said fear the bank. There is a difference. A risk you take with your own money, your own labor, your own land. That is a risk with a bottom. When it fails to a place you can stand up from. A risk you take with borrowed money against borrowed land has no bottom you can find before it finds you. I was never afraid of hard work or bad years. I was afraid of owing something I could not see the end of." Owen nodded. It was not the reflexive acknowledgement of something heard but not processed. It was the nod of someone filing something away in a place where it would remain accessible. June came to the shop door in the early afternoon with sandwiches and set them on the clean end of the workbench without interrupting what the two of them were doing. She looked at Owen working on the reassembly of the injectors and then at Colt going through the hydraulic filter housing. And the expression on her face was not one she would have described to anyone, but was the expression of a woman who has spent 40 years watching a man she respected be something worth watching, and is grateful for it. She went back inside without saying anything. When the shop work was done and the 4020 was reassembled and the tools were cleaned and put back in their places, Colt went to the house and came back with the tin box. He set it on the workbench between them and opened it and took out the ledger and set it in front of Owen. He said, "Your great-grandfather started this in 1919. I made the last entry in it in March of 1983, the day the Banking Commission issued its final ruling. I want you to have it, not as a keepsake, as a working document. When you farm, you keep a record." Everything you spend and everything you earn and everything you fix and everything you owe and everything you own free and clear, you do it by hand. Not because computers cannot do it faster, because the act of writing it yourself means you have read it, thought about it, and taken responsibility for understanding it. A number you have written with your own hand is a number you cannot pretend you did not know. Owen took the ledger and held it, the way you hold something you understand is being given rather than handed. Colt said, "There is an entry in there from September 14th, 1938. Read it when you get home. Read what your great-grandfather wrote at the bottom of that page. Read it more than once. Then put the book somewhere safe and keep it there until you need it." "You will know when that is," Owen said. "How will I know?" Colt said, "Because someone will tell you that what you have is not worth what you know it is worth. When that happens, you go find the book." They walked out of the shop together into the late afternoon. The corn in the near field stood motionless in the still air, the stalks in their full summer height casting long narrow shadows across the ground, across the fence to the east. Grady's ground lay in the same quiet, the same rows, the same patient order of a thing being properly tended. From somewhere in that direction, faint and steady, came the sound of a diesel engine under light load, moving across ground at the pace of work that knows what it is doing and is not in a hurry to be finished. Colt listened to it for a moment. It was a good sound. It was the sound of a man farming land he had earned back by doing the work correctly and accepting help without the pride that would have refused it. It was the sound of something that had been broken finding its way back to its function, not restored to what it had been, because that was not possible, but rebuilt into something that worked, which is a different kind of wholeness and in some ways a more durable one. Owen stood beside him and listened to it. After a while, the boy said, "That is Mr. Keller's tractor," Colt said. "It is." Owen said, "Is he a good farmer?" Colt said, "He is now. He learned the hard way, which is the way that stays learned." They went inside for supper. June had made pot roast and the kitchen smelled of it, and the windows had gone amber with the evening light, and the tin box sat on the counter where Colt had left it, the lid closed, its small dented corner toward the wall. The ledger was in Owen's hands. Outside, the fields held the last of the light and the sound from the east had gone quiet, the work done for the day, and the land settled into the stillness of a summer evening when everything that needed to happen has happened and the next day's work is waiting in the same patient way it always waits, indifferent to worry, responsive only to effort and attention and the kind of steady faithfulness that does not make for dramatic stories, but makes for farms that are still standing when everyone around them is not. Colt sat down at the table and Owen set the ledger carefully on the chair beside him, not on the table where it might get wet, and the three of them ate their supper in the amber light of a July evening in Harlan County, Iowa, in 1989, and did not talk about any of the things this story has been about, because they did not need to. Some things do not need to be spoken to be understood by the people who live them. The land outside was theirs. It had always been theirs. It would remain theirs. That was enough. That had always been enough.